If you keep looking at me like that, Mr. Cole, people are going to think you miss me. I said it lightly, like a joke, but my voice still caught on the last word. Across the glass table, Adrian Cole didn't even blink. He was exactly the same man I remembered from 3 years ago. Sharp suit, perfect posture, expensive watch, and that calm, impossible face that made everyone in the room sit straighter. Back then, he had been my boss, the kind of CEO who could turn a simple request into a command without ever raising his voice. He used to tell me to move faster, stay later, fix the numbers, resend the draft, book the car, cancel the meeting, and somehow I always did it, because when Adrian wanted something, the whole office seemed to bend around him. Now I was sitting in a quiet cafe downtown, pretending my hands weren't shaking while he watched me, as if we were the only two people in the city. Outside, October wind pushed yellow leaves across the sidewalk, and inside, the warm smell of coffee and cinnamon rolls wrapped around us like a memory I had no right to revisit. I had spent the last 3 years building a life that was mine. Smaller, quieter, safer. I worked as a freelance consultant now. I rented a modest apartment on the west side of Chicago, and I had a routine that kept my world neatly in order. Morning walks, client calls, grocery runs, and two tiny souls who had no idea how often I looked at their faces and thought of the man sitting across from me. My twins were back home with my sister, coloring at the kitchen table and probably arguing over who got the blue crayon. That thought alone was enough to soften the panic rising in my chest. They were healthy. They were happy. They were mine. Adrian's gaze dropped, briefly, to the folder on the table between us. "You didn't have to come in person," he said. His voice was still deep and controlled, but there was something different under it now. Less command, more caution. "You could have sent the report by email." I gave a small smile, because if I didn't smile, I might forget how to breathe. "And miss the pleasure of your company?" I'd never do that. It was easier to joke than to explain why I had nearly canceled this meeting 3 times, why my stomach had twisted the moment I saw his name on the client list, why the sight of him still hit me like a door opening onto a room I had locked long ago. Adrian leaned back, one hand resting near his coffee, the same hand that used to point at spreadsheets, sign off on mergers, tap twice on my desk when he wanted me in his office immediately. But now his eyes kept narrowing, not with irritation, but with focus, like he was trying to solve a puzzle he didn't remember starting. "You look different," he said at last. "Do I?" I asked, keeping my tone even. "Better, actually," he answered. "Less tired." I almost laughed at that, because if he only knew. If he knew how many nights I'd sat awake listening to 2 babies breathe in their sleep, terrified of the future and grateful for the present all at once. If he knew how many times I had wanted to call him, only to remember that 3 years ago, he had chosen his career, his image, and his pride over everything else. The twist of pain was old, but it still lived somewhere under my ribs. Then Adrian's expression changed. He looked up from the folder and studied my face again, slower this time, as if something in it had finally started to matter to him in a new way. "Have we met before?" he asked quietly. My heart stumbled. I kept my smile in place, but only barely, because the problem wasn't that he didn't remember me. The problem was that if he looked any closer, he might start to see the 2 reasons I could never let him know the truth too soon. The silence after his question stretched so long that I could hear the soft hum of the air conditioner above us. I kept my hands folded in my lap, careful, still, pretending my pulse had not just stumbled over itself. "Maybe you are just mistaking me for someone else," I said at last, letting a small smile do the work my voice could not. Adrian did not smile back. He leaned one elbow on the table, eyes fixed on me with that same measured focus he used to reserve for quarterly reports and impossible deadlines. "I am usually not that careless," he said. There was no accusation in his voice, which somehow made it worse. He had always been like that, never loud, never dramatic, just steady enough to make everyone else feel as if they were the ones losing control. I reached for my water glass, taking a slow sip while my mind raced. 3 years ago, I had known every version of him. The immaculate executive in boardrooms, the exhausted man after midnight, the rare, brief smile that made people in the office whisper like he was a rumor instead of a person. And I had also known the colder part of him, the one who thought feelings were liabilities and tenderness was something you could postpone until later. That was the part one had once loved too much and trusted too little. A server arrived with our coffee and set the cups between us. The moment the ceramic touched the table, Adrian looked down at my hands again. "You still do that," he said quietly. "Do what?" "Hold the cup with both hands when you are thinking." My breath caught. It was such a small thing, something no one should have remembered unless they had watched me closely for a very long time. I forced myself to shrug, aiming for casual. Old habits. Apparently. His gaze moved from my hands to my face, then lingered there like he was trying to match an old photograph to the person in front of him. "Your name?" he said, as if testing it. I gave it to him, and he repeated it once under his breath, thoughtful rather than certain. Then his phone vibrated on the table, a sharp interruption that broke the tension for a second. He glanced at the screen, frowned, and set it face down without answering. "You could have taken that," I said. "No one important." The words were simple, but they landed strangely in my chest. For a second, I almost forgot how to breathe. Once, years ago, I had been the person who believed I was important to him. I had carried that belief through late nights, through quiet office corridors, through every small act of attention that felt bigger than it should have. Then the company, the pressure, and his endless need to stay untouched by anything human had pulled us apart until there was nothing left except a memory I had learned to hide behind a calm face. Adrian studied me as if he could sense the shift in my expression. "You are good at that," he said. "At what?" "Looking composed while something is clearly bothering you." I almost told him the truth then, almost laughed from the sheer absurdity of it. If he only knew that everything in my life had been built around staying composed. The twins, their little routines, the way one always reached for the other in sleep, the quiet apartment I had made into a safe world because no one else would. I looked away toward the window, where the city moved in silver lines and reflected fragments of both of us back at me. Adrian followed my glance, then said, in a lower voice, "You have changed." It should not have felt like a dangerous sentence, but it did. "So have you," I replied. "Not enough, maybe." His answer came so quickly that I almost looked back too fast. When I did, he was still watching me, but something had shifted behind his eyes. Curiosity, yes. Recognition, maybe. And underneath both of them, the first hint of something warmer and far more dangerous. I could feel it before he spoke again. "Tell me something," he said. "Why does it feel like I have been trying to remember you for years?" My throat tightened, because the truth was standing right in front of him, hidden only by time, by fear, and by the two little lives waiting for me at home. And if his memory kept pulling him closer, I was not sure how much longer I would be able to keep that truth buried. I kept my expression calm, even as Adrian's words followed me long after he had stopped speaking. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at me, as if I were a problem he had nearly solved and could not yet bring himself to set aside. I should have felt relieved that he was curious instead of certain. Curiosity could be managed. Certainty could not. But the truth was that every question he asked seemed to brush against the edges of a life I had spent years carefully protecting. I reached for the glass of water in front of me and took a slow sip, buying myself a few more seconds to think. Across the table, Adrian watched me with a patience that felt almost unnatural for a man who once expected every room to bend around his will. The old version of him would have filled the silence with a command, a correction, or a cool dismissal. This version was quieter, and somehow that made him more dangerous. "You really do not remember?" I asked softly, keeping my voice even. He rested one hand near his cup and studied me in that direct, unnerving way of his. If I did, I would not be asking. There was no irritation in his tone, only a steady seriousness that made my chest tighten. For one absurd second, I wanted to laugh. Instead, I looked down at the table and traced a small circle on the smooth wood with my fingertip. "Then maybe it is better that way," I said. Adrian's brow shifted slightly. "Better for who?" I almost answered him honestly. "Better for me. Better for the two children who still believed the world was simple. Better for the fragile peace I had built one careful day at a time." But the answer died before it reached my tongue. I could not tell him that every step he took back into my life felt like a door opening in a house I had sealed shut years ago. I could not tell him that I had spent so long teaching myself how to stand on my own that being near him again made me feel both stronger and unbearably exposed. "For both of us," I said instead. He held my gaze for a long moment, as if weighing that answer against something older and deeper than this conversation. Outside the glass wall behind him, The city moved in bright afternoon lines, taxis slipping through traffic, pedestrians crossing in streams, life continuing exactly as if no one at this table was sitting on the edge of a secret that could change everything. Then Adrian leaned back slightly, his expression shifting into something more guarded. "You speak like someone who knows me very well," he said. "Maybe I used to." The words came out before I could stop them. His eyes sharpened at once, and I felt the air between us change. Not because I had confessed too much, but because I had confessed just enough to make him notice. I saw it then, the smallest flicker of something deep in his face. Not memory yet, not even recognition, but the beginning of a feeling that did not need names to become real. He looked at me as though my answer had touched a locked place inside him. "Used to," he repeated quietly. "Interesting." My heartbeat picked up, but I kept my posture relaxed. At that moment, the server arrived with our food, and I silently thanked the interruption. Plates were set between us, silverware adjusted, small courtesies that gave me a fragile shield. Adrian glanced at the meal, then back at me, as if the interruption had only made his focus stronger. "Tell me one thing," he said after the server walked away. "If we didn't know each other before, why did you disappear?" The question landed with such gentle precision that it almost hurt more than anger would have. I lowered my gaze to the plate in front of me, suddenly unable to pretend the room was steady. Because I had not simply disappeared. I had left behind a version of myself that could not survive the truth he represented. And now he was sitting across from me, calm and composed, with no idea that the past he was trying to recover had two small faces waiting for him at home. I lifted my eyes again and met his without blinking. "Because," I said carefully, "some things are harder to keep than others." Adrian did not speak, but the way his fingers tightened once against the edge of the table told me he had heard far more than I had said. And as the quiet settled again between us, I realized the distance I had protected for years was already beginning to break. I should have known Adrian would not let the silence stay comfortable for long. He sat across from me with that same controlled posture, one hand resting near his glass, the other relaxed against the table as if nothing in the world could rush him. But I could see it in the way his eyes kept returning to my face, then drifting away, then coming back again, as though some part of him was trying to place me in a memory he could not fully reach. The waiter came by with our food, and I welcomed the interruption more than I cared to admit. I lowered my gaze, thanked him softly, and used the moment to steady my breathing. When I looked up again, Adrian was already watching me. "You always do that," he said. "Do what?" I asked, even though I knew exactly what he meant. "Look like you are bracing for something I have not said yet." The corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, not quite anything at all. My fingers tightened around the napkin in my lap. I could not tell him that I had spent years bracing for this exact conversation, for this exact face, for the exact moment his curiosity would stop being polite and start becoming personal. Instead, I gave him the only answer that would not betray me. "Maybe I am just not used to being remembered." That earned me a pause. His gaze sharpened, and for the first time that evening, I saw something almost unguarded move across his face. Not recognition, not yet, but interest, deep enough to unsettle me. He leaned back slightly, studying me as if I had just said something far more revealing than I intended. "That is a strange thing to say," he replied. "Only if you assume people are always memorable for the right reasons," I said before I could stop myself. For a second, the words hung between us. I regretted them immediately, not because they were false, but because they sounded too close to the truth. Adrian's expression changed again, the smallest flicker of surprise followed by something heavier, quieter. He did not challenge me. He did not laugh. Instead, he looked down at his plate, then back at me, as if he had decided that whatever game he was playing, I was not as easy to corner as he had expected. That should have comforted me. Instead, it only made my pulse quicken, because the more careful he became, the more dangerous this dinner felt. Careful men asked the right questions. Careful men noticed the wrong details. Careful men looked twice at the shape of a smile, the sound of a familiar voice, the way someone paused before answering a simple question. And Adrian had always been careful, even back when he used to command every room he entered without raising his voice. The difference now was that I could feel the old power in him shifting into something less predictable. He was not ordering me around anymore. He was trying to understand me. That was worse. "You know," he said after a moment, his tone lighter but his eyes still fixed on mine. When I asked if we had met before, I expected a simpler answer. I let out a breath that was almost a laugh. You have never been especially fond of simple answers. His brows lifted a fraction. Have we met enough for you to know that? I almost closed my eyes. There it was again, that small, effortless pressure that made every word feel like a test I had not studied for. I reached for my water, using the glass to cover the tiny shake in my hand. Maybe I am just observant. Maybe you are avoiding me. I set the glass down carefully. Maybe you enjoy thinking that you can read people better than you can. His gaze held mine, unblinking. And maybe, he said, slower now, you are avoiding the part where you tell me why you look at me like I matter. My chest went tight. The restaurant noise around us blurred into a soft, distant wash of silverware and low conversation, but I could hear my own heartbeat too clearly. I had no safe answer for that. Not one he would believe. Not one that would not crack the fragile calm I had worked so hard to preserve. So I did the only thing I could. I looked at him steadily and let the silence answer for me. Adrian did not smile. He did not press. But his eyes changed, just slightly, as though my refusal had confirmed something he had already begun to suspect. And when he finally glanced away, it was only for a moment, long enough for me to realize that the evening was slipping beyond my control. Whatever he could not remember was still moving under the surface, and whatever he felt when he looked at me was growing stronger by the minute. I had wanted one quiet dinner, one careful conversation, one small chance to leave without exposing everything. Instead, I could feel the past leaning closer, breath by breath, until even the air between us seemed to hold its own memory. By the time the waiter cleared our plates, the room had settled into that polished kind of quiet that made every small sound feel deliberate. Adrian leaned back in his chair, one hand still near his glass, his expression unreadable in the warm light from the restaurant lamps. He looked composed in the way powerful men often did, but I could see the tension he never quite managed to hide for long. It lived in the pause before he spoke, in the way his gaze returned to my face as if drawn there without permission. I kept my own posture calm, even though every second beside him seemed to stretch tighter around me. I had survived years of learning how to stand still when my heart wanted to run. I had learned how to answer almost any question without telling the truth. But there was one truth sitting between us like a third chair, invisible and impossible to ignore. Adrian set his glass down and watched me for a long moment. You look different when you are not trying to get away from me, he said quietly. It was such a simple sentence, but it made something in my chest tighten. I gave him a small, careful smile and let my fingers rest against the tablecloth. Maybe that is because I am getting better at pretending, I said. The corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile, though it never fully formed. You were never very good at pretending, he replied. The words landed with more weight than they should have. I kept my eyes on him, refusing to look away first, though inside I felt the old, familiar pressure begin to rise. That was the danger of being near him. He still had that effect on me, even now. Not because he remembered everything, but because he remembered enough to unsettle me. Enough to make me feel seen in places I had spent years keeping hidden. A soft ring of a spoon against porcelain came from another table. Somewhere near the front of the restaurant, someone laughed too loudly, and then the sound faded. Adrian's gaze lowered for a brief moment, then came back to mine. When we first met, he said, "Did I know you?" My breath caught, but only for a second. He said it so evenly that anyone else might have mistaken it for idle curiosity. But I heard the careful edge underneath it. I heard the patience of a man circling a door that would not open. I folded my hands together so he would not see the slight tremor in them. You asked that like you are expecting a different answer every time, I said. Maybe I am, he answered. There was no pressure in his tone, no open accusation. That almost made it worse. Because if he had been angry, I could have defended myself. If he had been dismissive, I could have walked away. But he was neither. He was paying attention. Too much attention. I let out a slow breath and looked down at the edge of my napkin, buying myself a few extra seconds. People cross paths all the time, I said. Sometimes they remember it. Sometimes they do not. And which one are you hoping I am? I did not answer. The silence between us deepened, but it was not empty. It was full of everything I could not say and everything he seemed determined to find. When I looked back up, Adrian was still watching me, his expression softer now, but also more dangerous in its stillness. Not threatening, just focused. You always do that, he said. Do what? Leave the important part unsaid. My pulse jumped once, hard enough that I had to steady my breathing before I spoke again. Maybe I learned it from you. That finally made him pause. It was only a brief shift, a flicker across his eyes, but I caught it. He had not expected that. For 1 second the mask slipped, and behind it I saw something uncertain, something almost familiar, as if the words had reached a place in him that had not fully gone dark. Then it was gone again, replaced by his usual control. He leaned forward slightly, resting one forearm near the table's edge. Then maybe you know something I do not, he said. I almost laughed, but the sound never came. Instead, I smiled in that thin, careful way I had perfected over years. Maybe, I said. The air between us changed after that. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, but enough for me to feel it in my skin. Adrian's attention sharpened, and with it came the uncomfortable sense that I was no longer the only one guarding a secret. He was starting to look at me like a puzzle he had no intention of leaving unsolved. And the worst part was that some small, reckless part of me wanted to let him keep looking. But I could not afford that. Not yet. Not when 2 little lives were waiting for me at home, trusting me to keep their world steady. Not when one wrong word could bring everything crashing down before I was ready. So I lifted my glass, took one slow sip, and gave him nothing more than a steady look across the table. Adrian watched me over the rim of his own glass, silent now, as if he understood that I had reached the edge of what I would give him tonight. The restaurant lights reflected faintly in his eyes, making them seem even deeper, even harder to read. He did not push. He did not ask again. But I could feel it in the air, in the measured stillness of his body, in the way his gaze remained fixed on me long after I had stopped speaking. He was remembering something, or trying to, and I was running out of room to hide from it. I did not realize how much the evening had unsettled me until I was finally alone in the quiet of my apartment, standing in the kitchen with my coat still on and the soft glow of the under-cabinet lights spilling over the counter. Adrian's last look at me kept replaying in my mind, steady and searching, as if he had already sensed there was more to my life than I had allowed him to see. I set my keys down carefully, then rested one hand on the edge of the counter and breathed in slowly, trying to slow the way my thoughts kept racing ahead of me. The twins were asleep in the next room, and just knowing they were there was enough to tighten my chest with a kind of protective fear I had lived with for years. It was not that I doubted my ability to care for them. It was that I had worked so hard to build a life where no one could come in and tear it apart. And Adrian, with his calm voice and his unsettling memory and the way he looked at me like he was trying to fit a missing piece back into place, had begun to feel like exactly the kind of danger I had spent years avoiding. I should have been relieved he had not pressed harder at dinner. I should have been grateful that he had let the silence remain between us instead of forcing me into an answer I was not ready to give. But there was something worse than pressure, something far more dangerous, and it was the patience in him. Men like Adrian did not forget. They did not stop looking once they became interested. They circled back. They watched. They waited. And the more I thought about the way he had studied my face across that restaurant table, the more I understood that he was not simply curious. He was remembering pieces I had buried too carefully for too long. I took off my coat and folded it over the back of a chair, then crossed the apartment in quiet steps and pushed open the twins' bedroom door. The soft night light painted the room in a warm gold, and both boys were curled under their blankets, their breathing slow and even, their little faces relaxed in sleep. Seeing them always steadied me, no matter how shaken I felt myself. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the faint hush of the city beyond the window, and let the weight of the day settle in my bones. They were the reason I had kept so much hidden. They were the reason I had smiled when I wanted to cry, lied when I wanted to explain, and walked away from every risk that might have drawn attention to us. But tonight, for the first time in years, I felt the edges of that life beginning to fray. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and my heart jumped before I even looked at the screen. It was a message from Adrian. Just one line. "Are you home yet?" I stared at it for several seconds, my thumb hovering over the phone while every part of me argued with itself. It was such a simple question, the kind anyone could ask without meaning anything by it. Yet coming from him, after the way he had looked at me all evening, it felt like the beginning of something I could not stop. I typed and erased a reply twice before finally sending. Yes. The answer appeared beneath my message almost immediately. Get some rest. You look tired tonight. I felt a strange ache at that, one I did not want to name. There was nothing dangerous about concern on a screen, nothing threatening about a polite message from an old boss who had once ruled my days with impossible standards and a voice that could make an entire office go silent. And yet, when I set the phone down, my hand was trembling just enough for me to notice. I moved to the living room and sat on the edge of the sofa, staring at the dark window that reflected only a faint shape of my own face back at me. Outside, the streets were quiet, traffic thinning to a distant hush. Somewhere in the building, a door closed softly, then all was still again. I thought about the restaurant, about the way Adrian had paused before asking me if we had ever met somewhere else, and about the careful way I had denied it. Not a lie exactly, just not the whole truth. The distinction had carried me this far. It had protected me when I needed it most. But now that Adrian was closer, the half-truths felt thinner than paper. If he kept circling the memories he could not place, he might eventually reach the night everything changed. He might remember my name. He might remember the version of himself I had once known, the one who used to order me around with sharp words and an infuriating confidence, never imagining that life would someday make him look at me differently. The thought should have made me feel triumphant. Instead, it filled me with unease. Because the man who once dismissed my presence so easily was no longer the same man sitting across from me in that restaurant. He was quieter now, sharper in a different way, and there was a weight in him I had not expected. He carried himself like someone who had lost things he could not name and had spent years trying to find them again. I understood that kind of loss too well. I leaned back into the sofa and closed my eyes for just a second, but his face came back immediately, and with it the memory of the way his gaze had softened whenever it drifted toward my hands, as if some instinct in him recognized what his mind still could not. It frightened me how quickly old feelings, old fear, and old hope could begin to twist together into something I no longer knew how to control. Somewhere down the hall, one of the twins turned in his sleep and murmured softly, and I opened my eyes at once, drawn back to the present by the small sound. I stood up and went to check on them again, brushing a strand of hair from one boy's forehead, then the other. Their trust was absolute. Their world was simple, and I had made it my job to keep it that way. But as I stood there in the dim light, I could not shake the feeling that the past was already on its way back to me, patient and unstoppable, carrying Adrian with it one careful step at a time. I did not hear Adrian approach, only noticed that the apartment seemed to hold its breath a second before his voice reached me from the doorway. I turned from the kitchen counter with one hand still resting there, and for a moment neither of us spoke. He looked different outside the office, less polished in the harsh white light of my small home, but no less composed. If anything, the quiet made him more difficult to read. His eyes moved once across the room, not lingering on anything in particular, yet I had the strange sense that he was taking in everything. The low lamp on the side table, the blanket folded over the arm of the sofa, the two little pairs of shoes lined neatly by the wall. You disappeared before I could ask if you got home all right, he said at last, his tone calm enough to be polite, but not so calm that it felt casual. I forced myself to keep my expression even. I am home. That should have ended it. It would have, with anyone else. But Adrian took one step farther inside, just enough to close the distance without forcing me to retreat. That is not what I asked. I gave a quiet, almost tired exhale, because there was no use pretending I had not understood exactly what he meant. His gaze stayed on me, steady and unflinching, and I could feel the old instinct rise in me at once, the one that had once made me stand straighter, answer faster, and reveal less. He had always been able to make a room feel smaller without raising his voice. I had forgotten that detail about him, or maybe I had spent years trying not to remember it. I am fine, I said. The boys are asleep. Nothing happened. His jaw shifted slightly, not enough to be obvious to anyone who did not know him well, but I knew him well enough to catch the smallest signs. He did not believe me. Worse, he did not seem satisfied by the version of me I was offering him. You are still doing that, he said quietly. Still answering only the part you want me to hear. The words landed with the kind of precision that made it hard to breathe through them. I looked away first, because if I kept meeting his eyes, I might say something reckless. The apartment was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant, even breathing from the twins' room. That sound kept me anchored, kept me from drifting too far into the past that had begun pressing against me from every side. "You came here late," I said, changing the subject with more effort than it should have taken. "Was there something you needed?" Adrian did not answer right away. Instead, he glanced toward the hallway, and when he spoke again, his voice had lowered by a fraction. "I kept thinking about what you said at dinner." My throat tightened. Of course he had. Men like Adrian did not let words pass through them untouched. They held on to them, weighed them, turned them over until something hidden in the shape of them finally came into focus. "There was a time," he continued, "when I could tell what you were thinking before you said a single word." I almost laughed, but the sound never came. That was the trouble with memories. They arrived in pieces, never the whole story. One moment they were harmless, and the next they were standing in the doorway again, looking at you with the same eyes you had once trusted too much. I folded my arms lightly, more to steady myself than to shut him out. "People change," I said. "So do situations." "Do they?" he asked, and there was something in that simple question that made my pulse jump. He was watching me closely now, not with suspicion exactly, but with the kind of concentration that made me feel visible in a way I had not planned for. "Because I do not think you have changed as much as you want me to believe." I felt my shoulders go still. He was not accusing me. That was what made it worse. He sounded certain, almost gentle, as if he were trying to pull a truth into the open without frightening it away. I held his gaze for one long second, then looked down at the counter. "You do not know anything about my life now," I said. "And that is exactly why I am here," he replied. The answer was so immediate that it caught me off guard. I lifted my head again. He was no longer standing as if he had simply stopped by out of obligation. He looked rooted in place, as though the decision to come had cost him more than he wanted to admit. "I am not asking for everything," he said. "I am asking for the part that matters." My mouth went dry. The part that mattered. There were too many things in my life that mattered, and almost all of them were things I had learned to protect in silence. Before I could answer, a small sound drifted from down the hall, a soft murmur from one of the twins shifting in sleep. The noise changed the shape of the room instantly. My attention broke away from Adrian, every nerve in me turning toward the bedroom. He noticed. I saw it in the brief flicker of his eyes as they followed mine toward the hallway, then back to me, and some quiet realization seemed to settle across his face. Not complete understanding. Not yet, but enough to make the silence between us heavier than before. I stepped back instinctively, as if distance could still help me. Adrian did not follow, but his voice softened when he spoke. "You are not alone in this," he said. I knew he meant the room, the conversation, perhaps even the long wait of whatever had passed between us years ago. But the words still struck somewhere deep and vulnerable, because they sounded too much like an offer and too much like a promise. And promises were dangerous when you had spent so long learning how to survive without them. I looked toward the hallway again, then back at him, trying to find a safe shape for the truth and failing. The night had already gone too far for easy lies. If I let him stay, he would keep asking. If I sent him away, he would remember that too. And standing there with my heart beating too hard and my past pressed close enough to touch, I realized that the next few minutes would matter far more than I wanted them to. I did not expect Adrian to return so soon. For the first few minutes after he left, the apartment had felt almost too quiet, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see whether I would fall apart. I had washed the dishes twice, even though they were already clean, and then stood at the kitchen sink with my hands braced on the edge, trying to steady the strange, restless feeling that had taken over my chest. It was not panic exactly. It was worse than that. It was the uneasy knowledge that I had reached a point where avoiding him would no longer be simple. By the time I heard the front door, I had already convinced myself to stay calm. That lasted until I saw him standing there again, coat open, hair slightly disordered from the wind, one hand holding a paper bag from the bakery down the street. He paused when he saw me, and something unreadable crossed his face before he set the bag on the counter. "You did not eat much," he said quietly. It was not a question, which somehow made it feel more intimate. I folded my arms, more out of habit than defense. "You came back with dinner?" "I came back with something warm," he replied. His voice held that same careful balance he used in the office, but here, in my kitchen, it seemed gentler around the edges. He looked at the clean dishes, then at the cup I had left drying by the window, as if he could read the evening from the objects I had touched. "You are still trying to handle this alone," he said. I let out a short breath that was almost a laugh, except there was no humor in it. "That has worked for me until now." Adrian's gaze stayed on me, steady and impossible to ignore. "Has it?" The question landed softly, but it carried weight. I looked away first, toward the dim living room, where the lamp I had turned on earlier cast a narrow circle of light over the couch. The whole apartment felt too small for the conversation we were having, too small for the history pressing at the edges of every word. I wished, suddenly and intensely, that I had chosen somewhere larger, somewhere less personal, where the past could not hide in plain sight among my books and folded blankets and the framed sketch on the shelf. But this was where I lived now. This was where my life had been rebuilt, and Adrian was standing inside it, not as a memory, but as a man who had somehow found his way back. He opened the paper bag and drew out a container of soup, still sealed, along with bread and a small dessert I did not recognize. The ordinary care of it almost made me miss how serious he looked. "You do not have to prove anything tonight," he said. "Not to me." My throat tightened before I could stop it. The worst part was that I believed him, at least enough to make the words dangerous. Because if I accepted even a little kindness, I would have to admit how badly I had wanted it all along. I set one hand on the counter to steady myself and looked at him more directly. "Why are you doing this?" He did not answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document, placing it on the counter between us. Not close enough to demand anything, but close enough that I had to look at it. "Because there are things we need to discuss before this gets harder," he said. My stomach tightened. "Harder how?" Adrian's eyes lifted to mine, and for the first time all evening, the careful control in his expression gave way to something sharper, something that looked very much like fear wearing a better suit. "Because I know enough now to understand that you have been carrying this on your own for far too long," he said. "And I am not leaving until I know what you have been protecting from me." The room seemed to narrow around us. I could hear the low hum of the refrigerator, the faint traffic outside, the soft rustle of the grocery bag as it settled against the floor. Everything else had gone still. I looked at the document, then back at him, and felt the last of my remaining distance begin to fail. The truth was no longer something I could keep safely behind my teeth. Adrian had come back with patience, with concern, and with the kind of determination that did not ask permission to stay. And as he stood there in my kitchen, waiting without moving, I understood that whatever happened next would change the shape of both of our lives. I stood in the kitchen long after Adrian had stopped speaking, my fingers still resting on the edge of the counter as if I needed the pressure to remind myself that the room was real. The document in his hand looked too ordinary for something that could change everything. A folded sheet of paper, a date, a name, and beneath that, the quiet proof of the life I had been trying to protect from the world. Adrian did not move. He simply waited, his expression no longer impatient or uncertain, but steady in that unnerving way that made it impossible to look away from him. I had spent so many years believing that distance would keep me safe, that silence would spare me from having to explain what had happened and why I had disappeared, but standing there now I could feel that shield cracking under the weight of his patience. "You were going to keep this from me forever," he said at last, and there was no anger in it. Only a kind of stunned hurt that made my throat close. I looked down before I could answer. The hardest part was not the fear. It was the shame. The shame of having carried this alone, of having made every decision in secret, of having told myself over and over that I was doing the right thing simply because I did not know how to do anything else. "I did not know how to tell you," I said quietly. My voice sounded small in the wide, dim kitchen. "I did not know if you would want this, or me, or either of them." For a moment he said nothing. The traffic outside moved in a faint wash of sound. Somewhere in the building, a door shut softly. Then Adrian lowered the paper and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on him before, something stripped bare and almost painfully human. "You thought I would not want my own children?" he asked. I swallowed hard. "I thought you were someone else back then," I said, and that was the truth I had avoided for years. "And when I left, I told myself it was easier to let you stay that version of yourself than to find out what had changed." His jaw tightened, not with anger, but with the effort of holding himself still. I could see him working through it, through the years he had lost, through the strange and impossible fact of standing in my kitchen and learning that the life he had forgotten had not vanished at all. It had simply gone on without him. I remember enough now, he said slowly, to know I was not good to you. My chest tightened. That is not the same as remembering everything. No, he said, and his gaze dropped, briefly, to my stomach before returning to my face. But it is enough to know I do not get to walk away from this. The words landed softly, but they carried a weight that made my knees feel unsteady. I had imagined this moment in so many different ways over the years. I had imagined anger, denial, cold disbelief. I had never imagined that he would sound like someone trying to choose responsibility before fear could stop him. He took a slow breath, then reached out, not touching me yet, only resting his hand flat against the counter beside mine, as though he wanted me to know he was there without forcing anything. Tell me what you need, he said. Not what is easiest. Not what you think I can handle. What do you need? The question undid me more than any accusation would have. It was so simple, so direct, so unlike the version of Adrian I had built my life around remembering. I blinked hard and looked away toward the window, where the evening had deepened into a soft blue darkness over the city lights. My reflection hovered faintly in the glass, and behind it, his figure stood quiet and patient, as if he had decided that for tonight, and perhaps for as long as it took, he would not let me disappear again. I did not answer right away. I could hear the small sounds of the apartment, the refrigerator hum, the soft tick of cooling pipes, the distant roll of a bus below the street. Everything in me felt stretched thin, but for the first time, the silence between us did not feel like a wall. It felt like a doorway. I need time, I said finally. I need honesty, and I need you to understand that this is not only about you. Adrian nodded once, as if he had expected nothing less. It is about all of us, he said. The word all of us settled over the room with a strange gentleness. Not a promise, not yet, but something wider than the loneliness I had lived inside for too long. He picked up the document again, glanced at it, and then set it carefully on the counter as though it were fragile. I am not asking you to forgive me tonight, he said. I am asking you not to shut the door before I have a chance to earn my way back in. My breath caught. The honesty in his voice was almost unbearable. He was not trying to win. He was trying to stay. And somehow, that made everything more dangerous. I thought of all the nights I had spent imagining this confrontation, all the versions in which he left, and I was left alone with my fear, all the times I had rehearsed the words I would never say. None of them had prepared me for the simple fact of his presence now, steady and impossible, looking at me like the past could still be repaired if we were both willing to stand inside the ruins long enough. He took one careful step closer, then stopped. Can I stay tonight? He asked. The question was not demanding. It was almost hesitant, but it sent a shiver through me all the same. I looked at him, at the man I had once loved, at the stranger who had become familiar again one impossible hour at a time, and felt the last of my defenses begin to loosen. You can stay, I said, and the words came out before I could stop them. His shoulders eased by the smallest amount, like someone setting down a weight he had been carrying for miles. He did not smile. Neither did I. There was too much still unsaid, too much still waiting in the dark between memory and truth. But when he reached for the grocery bag and began to set the things he had bought on the counter one by one, as if helping with the ordinary work of the evening might keep the fragile piece from breaking, I understood that this was how it would begin. Not with absolution, not with certainty, but with a man who had finally come back to face what he had left behind, and with me, standing in the middle of my kitchen, realizing that the life I had guarded so fiercely was no longer something I could protect alone.